Allow me to lead you into the study of 1 Corinthians chapter 13 with kind of an extended introduction. The Corinthians had a hard time figuring out how Christianity worked, how they were supposed to live their lives as Christians, especially in regards to one another. They were so focused on themselves as individuals. It was all about me. God loves me, and I don't really care if he loves you or not. It's not my problem. God has blessed me, and I'm not particularly worried about whether he has blessed you or not. God must have chosen me because I have some great quality that he couldn't do without. He means it. So I am, compared to you, very special. Now, they had a hard time catching on to the idea that what Jesus had done for them was to be shared among them. They were to love each other, to support each other, to cheer for each other, to provide for each other, to sacrifice for each other. So the church in Corinth had to be a very uncomfortable place. They were suing each other. I imagine some fairly wealthy Christian owned an apartment building or two, and in a showy performance of being a benefactor and having people look up to him and respect him with the dignity that he really deserves, he rented out apartments to Christians, probably at what he thought were bargain prices. But then some of the poorer Christians probably wouldn't be able to pay their rent because they had unexpected expenses. A child got sick and they had to pay a doctor to come and take care of their child. And so the benefactor, the wealthier Christian, the high and mighty Christian, would take them to court and sue them to pay their debts to him. Some of the men of the church were hiring prostitutes. I mean, can you imagine thinking that that was okay? But they did. They thought it was perfectly okay for them to do that. And their only concern was to find physical satisfaction, have a little fun. You know, what's wrong with having a good time, they thought. It's about me. Their marriages were not love one another, dedicated relationships. Instead, they seemed to be marriages of convenience. You know, as long as my wife, as long as my husband satisfies me the way that I think he should, the way that she should, then we'll stay married. But otherwise, I'm on a search for a new mate, someone who can make it fun, and who can give me all the attention that I need and all the good things that I think that I am entitled to. And then there were these spiritual gifts, big, showy works of power that God had given them. To the Corinthians, they signaled that these made people look at you and say, wow, you are an incredibly spiritual person. Gifts were about proving how spiritual you were, how close to God you were compared to someone else. So they were especially into things like speaking in tongues. You know, they'd been taught even by their pagan worship before they became Christians that speaking in tongues was a sign that their God had somehow inhabited your body and now is speaking through your lips. And so it showed a very deep spiritual relationship to them. But it was all about them. They were saying to one another, I can speak in tongues and you can't. So Paul keeps trying to correct their misconceptions and get them to understand that the point of the Christian life is one another. It is life together. It is loving like Jesus loved us. So he will say in 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 28, God chose the lowly things of this world and the things and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are. And Paul is not putting them down as though they were worthless. You know, he's not trying to put them into their place, but rather what he's doing is trying to get them to see that God has chosen them not because they were great and powerful, but because he loved them. And their relationship with God is based on their love and on God's love for them. In regards to suing one another, Paul will say in 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 7, the very fact that you have lawsuits among you means you have been completely defeated already. Why not rather be wrong? Why not rather be cheated? Love should be the deciding factor in your relationships with one another, not getting your rights or getting what you deserve or being respected the way you should be respected. It's about love. He will say to them, stop trying to find pleasure in all the wrong ways. 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 20, you bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. In your marriages, the point is to care for your spouse and not to try to make them meet all of your needs. He says in verse 4 of chapter 7, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. And then when it comes to spiritual gifts, Paul points out how these are meant to enable us to care for one another and to support one another in very special ways. It's like how a body works, Paul says, with all the parts having different functions, but all working together so that the whole body works the way that it's supposed to. All the parts are important. All the parts care about each other. All the parts protect the other parts that are having a hard time. And so he says these gifts are about how you can love one another. In chapter 13, then, Paul talks about love. He says, in the very last verse of 1 Corinthians chapter 12, let me show you a different, altogether better way of being spiritually gifted. He says, first of all, these showy spiritual gifts don't matter at all if they're not used to show my love for others. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 1. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I'm nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Now, let me ask you to stop and just discuss 2 or 3 questions here. You can stop the tape after each one of these questions as you talk about it and then start it again. Number 1, what sorts of things do people do to try to get you to like them? Number 2, why do you think people show off? And how do show-offs make you feel? Number 3, what is the best way to get people to like you? Then Paul talks about what love does and how a loving person is lovable, how a loving person promotes the kind of lives in others that God was looking for when he saved them, how a loving person is someone that everyone can always depend on instead of being angry at most of the time. Verse 4, love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Now, again, discussion questions. Number 1, what sorts of things are going on when you feel really comfortable at church? Number 2, how do close friends treat each other? Number 3, do you think everyone at church should be your close friend? Why or why not? And number 4, what do you think people at church should expect of you? And along with that, what should you expect from them? Now, the idea that Paul is promoting here is that if you want people to think you're really somebody, love them, and they'll think you're the greatest person that ever lived. All these things that the Corinthians are counting on, that they're depending on for feeling good about themselves, just aren't dependable in the long haul. It doesn't get them where they want to go. He will say in verse 8, love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. You know, about the time that you need somebody to tell you okay. And so you're going to get up in front of the church and preach this grand sermon or make this great prophetic statement. And you stand up there and suddenly there is no voice from God, no revelation, no angel telling you what to do. And you just stand there looking like a fool. What then? Or you're having a bad day and God seems so far away from you, so you run to your closet and you try to speak in that heavenly tongue that you think God has given you, and the words won't come. Now how do you feel about God? Or when your baby dies and you're holding his lifeless body in your hands and tears are running down your cheeks, what do you need? Oh, here's a book about nuclear physics. I found this to be chock full of knowledge, things that are interesting, things you'd like to know. Or even maybe somebody hands you a book about grief and says, these are about the stages of grief. You need to know what's going on with you. Do you need a friend who will be there for you? Verse 9, for we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When we learn to love one another completely, all that stuff that we think we depend on just sort of fades away. Okay, here's some discussion questions. Number one, why are people lonely? Number two, why do you think we need someone to love us? And number three, what are some ways people try to replace love in their lives? You know, there are people that may be unloved. They just have that, they don't have anybody to love them. Or maybe there are people who just think they're not loved. But how do they try to replace that love in their lives? All right, says Paul, it's time to stop acting like selfish children and start caring about each other. Verse 11, he says, when I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall be fully known. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. I think Paul is going back to what this selfish use of spiritual gifts gets you. Only a dim vision of what God is like and what he really wants from us. We're used to mirrors that are highly polished, made out of glass and silver, and we can see in a mirror almost perfectly. They, in those days, had bronze mirrors, and they were scratched and scuffed and curvy, all bent out of shape, and the reflection was terrible. It was hard to see anything in a mirror. If you truly want to know God, Paul says, you have to stop looking at yourself and start looking at God. If you want to really know someone else, you have to stop worrying about yourself and start loving her or loving him. If you really want people to see how great you are, you have to love them. And they then will know the magnificent you. And you'll come to know them in new, wonderful ways. So here's the discussion questions. Number one, what do you see in a mirror? Number two, according to Paul, what do you see when you love someone? Number three, what are some of the risks involved in loving someone? And number four, what are the rewards of loving someone? When you get right down to it, there are three big ideas that are involved in the Christian life. There's faith, there's hope, and there's love. Faith that shapes your loyalty to God and gets you through tough times because you trust Jesus. There's hope. Hope that keeps you going because you know that there is something out there that is greater and better than anything we are suffering right now, or even enjoying right now, for that matter. And then there's love. Loving God, loving our brothers and sisters, loving other people. The greatest of these, Paul says, is love. Faith and hope are great and vital things. You have to have faith and hope or you don't even have God. But faith and hope, as great as they are, aren't love. When you're successful and you're happy and you're on top of the world, you need somebody to share it with and to love you. When you're lonely, you need someone to hug you. When you're hurting, you need someone to cry with you. When you're depressed, you need someone to be on your side. When you think you're worthless, you need someone to look up to you and care that you're alive. You need love. And the only way that you'll ever get love is by giving it. So here is the last discussion question. In your opinion, what is the best way to develop the ability to love others? Now, please pray for more love for each other.